This is lesson 3 of a study focusing on a period of time known as the United Kingdom, a period of history for the nation of Israel. And we want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of our study. We want God to bless our study, and so let's take a moment to pray together. Our Father in God, we're grateful to you for the information that we see in your word. We're grateful that this information gives us instruction, shows us things that we need to know. We're grateful for both encouragement from the word and warnings from it. Help us to pay special attention to those things that would harm us from being the kind of people who could have your blessings. And now, Father, bless us as we think together. We pray that we might always seek your honor first. In Jesus' name, amen. Our goal in this particular study is to cover 1 Samuel chapter 16 through 26. If you are an average reader, it would take you about 35 minutes to read these chapters. I think that already makes it impossible for us to give our full attention to every detail within these 11 chapters. An added complication comes from the fact that within these chapters are some events and situations that really in and of themselves could occupy a complete lesson. We're going to have to move quickly through some of those. I apologize for that ahead of time. I hope you will take the time at some point to carefully read 1 Samuel 16 through 26. My intention from these chapters is to focus on King Saul and how he was sinking deeper and deeper into sin, his behavior becoming more and more irrational as he is consumed by jealousy of David and hatred for him. It is not a pleasant picture, but it is one that we really need to see. And hopefully, after we've looked at the text and examined some things from it, we will make some observations that might be helpful to us as we deal with the problem of jealousy. First of all, let's start with the background before Saul's jealousy. By the time you reach 1 Samuel 16, God had already declared on 2 separate occasions, found in chapters 13 and chapter 15, that the throne of Saul would be taken away and would be given to a better man. And we are introduced to that better man in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. Actually, the choice would be a surprising one. Samuel must have felt deeply about Saul's failures and his actions. And he was evidently mourning him, and God told him to stop doing that. If you look at chapter 16, verse 1, now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel?" And then God added this, "Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." And so God is very specific. He tells Samuel, here's where I want you to go. Here's the family I want you to go to. And among that man's sons, you will find the new king. When Samuel had that opportunity to look over the sons of Jesse, He was sure that Eliab, likely the oldest one, must be the one, not God's choice. And you probably are aware that 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, is not only an important verse, but certainly a well-known verse. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so God knew that just the oldest, or maybe the brightest, or the most skilled, or whomever, was not really his choice. 7 sons were seen, and there is but one more remaining. When you get down to verse 11, of chapter 16, Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? Then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is, keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. Evidently, in Jesse's mind, David was so unimportant that he need not even be seen among the choices. But Samuel said, bring him here. And then when David is brought, we read in verse 11, so he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. And so David becomes the anointed one. Though he was anointed, he would not take his place on the throne immediately. In fact, he would have to go through a long series of ordeals before he could be called the king of Israel. At this point, in chapter 16, the narrative shifts back to Saul. And things were not going well with him. When you look at verse 14, it tells us, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. I can understand, as you can, the Spirit of the Lord departing from Saul. He was not fit to have God's Spirit with him in any way. I think we wish we understood the rest of verse 14 better about this distressing spirit. But I would say that most of what we could say about it would simply be speculation, and so we must simply accept it as it's stated. Now, Saul's servants had a suggestion for him, and Saul agreed to it. If you look at verse 16, one of the servants said, Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that when he will play it with his hand, when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. Someone was aware that David was such a skillful musician. David was selected, brought to Saul, and he began to help him to have relief during those distressing times. I think we especially need to focus on verse 21 because it says, So David came to Saul and stood before him, notice, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So at the very beginning of the relationship, Saul loves David. He is impressed with him. One of the most familiar stories of the Bible, one that you have heard many times comes from chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. We're going to have to just summarize it quickly. God's people were once again faced with a threat from the Philistines. It's amazing how many times the Philistines presented a problem to God's people. This time, there was a champion of the Philistines, a 9-foot tall soldier by the name of Goliath. And he issued a personal challenge for a one-on-one duel. He would fight any representative of the Jewish army. And the reaction on the part of the Jews to this was not good. Verse 11 says of chapter 17, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They felt like they had no champion who could best this Philistine giant. The challenge offered went on for 40 days. This, of course, is so much unlike modern warfare. But here are two armies opposing each other. One representative is calling out a representative from the other army, and that will decide who wins this struggle. David, as you know, eventually became the one to fight that Philistine giant. He was armed with only a sling and 5 smooth stones that had been taken from a brook. But it only took one of those stones to bring down that giant. If you look at chapter 17, verse 48, so it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell down on his face to the earth. David quickly got the giant's sword and cut off his head with it. And that prompted the Jews to rally, to return to a place of courage, and they won a decisive victory over the Philistine army. We would say at this point that David must be well on his way toward becoming a hero in Israel. When you get to chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, you begin to see the basis for Saul's initial jealousy. You see, among other things, an unlikely event happened. Jonathan, Saul's son, became David's friend. But not just a casual friend. If you look at chapter 18 and verse 1, you see now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Again, verse 3, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Also in verse 4, we will see that this was not just a one-way regard, for David would have a deep regard for Jonathan as well. Jonathan took off the robe that was with him, gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. And so this would be a friendship that really gives us the true example of what a great friendship is like. Two men really caring deeply for each other. When David's success continued, and we read that verse 5 says in chapter 18, so David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely, and Saul set him over men of war, and he was accepted in the sight, notice, of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. That success prompted people to express vocal admiration for David. Verse 6, now it had happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, and probably there's a footnote here that adds an S to this, plural, Philistines, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. One person was not enamored with David's success. And verse 8 shows not only Saul's displeasure, but his irrational logic. Verse 8, then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Again, I emphasize irrational logic. The praise of the people in no way indicated that David should become king instead of Saul. But Saul is not thinking correctly. And so when you get to verse 9, a very short sentence, but one of importance. So Saul eyed David from that day forward. That could also be translated, viewed with suspicion. He looked upon him with suspicion from this point forward. Now, please keep this in mind. David had not done anything wrong. He was in no way responsible for the people praising him. He didn't have a campaign to be praised. And he is not deserving of Saul's anger or his hatred. But he will have it. The third thing to consider would be the behavior of Saul's jealousy. And from this point forward in the text, Saul seems to lose all control of his emotions, and his actions repeatedly were directed at harming others. I'm going to just go over these examples briefly. I hope you will look at them in more detail yourself. Chapter 18, he threw a spear at David, trying to pin him to the wall. That's verse 11. We're told twice in verse 12 and 15 that Saul was afraid of David. Again in chapter 18, Saul hoped to get David killed in a battle with the Philistines. That's verse 25. And when it didn't happen, the text tells us that Saul feared David even more. The final sentence of verse 29 says this, so Saul became David's enemy continually. David did not choose to be Saul's enemy, but Saul chose to be David's enemy. In chapter 19 and verse 1, he tries to get his servants and his son Jonathan to kill David. And in the same chapter, verse 10, Saul launches another spear at David, intending to kill him. In verse 11, he sent messengers to watch the house of David and to kill him when he departed from it, but David escaped. In verse 20, he again sent messengers to take David. Do we see a pattern that's developed here? Do you see a man who is now absolutely lost all sense of rational behavior? In chapter 20, Saul became so angry with his son Jonathan for not helping him to try to kill David that he berated him and even tried to kill him. I want you to look for just a moment at how bad this has come to be. If you look at chapter 20 and verse 30, then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" And then in verse 33, "Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David." Jonathan fully recognizes that if Saul would kill his own son in his anger for David, that he certainly intended to kill David himself. There's one more thing that we need to see, and that is the burden that was placed on David by Saul's jealousy. So far, we've mostly concentrated on Saul and his irrational behavior. But what about David? What kind of toll did Saul's jealousy take on David? Well, in chapter 22, we are told that he had to hide in a cave. In the same chapter, we are told that he sought a place of safety for his parents as he goes to the king of Moab and begs that he might keep them until he finds out what's going to happen with him. Does he think that Saul might even harm his parents? David had to endure the pain of seeing innocent priests and their families murdered, their livestock destroyed by Saul's men, again because of irrational thinking. In chapter 23, David was forced to flee and to run from Saul and to try to stay away from Saul and his men. The toll on David was great. But I want you to notice this, because it's very important. In both chapters 24 and 26 of 1 Samuel, we see that David could have easily struck back and killed Saul. He had that within his power at that time. And in spite of Saul's attitude, David took the high ground. How he should be respected for that. Many times when people do us wrong, we are tempted to repay them and perhaps even give them more than they've given us. David wouldn't do that. Now let's wrap this up. What can we learn from the jealousy of Saul? Well, lots of things. But let's begin with this. Jealousy, as it's seen in Saul's life, has to be harmful. It certainly harmed Saul. It ate away at his soul. And we see his behavior becoming more and more irrational all the time because he had not confronted this problem. Saul's jealousy certainly harmed David as he was forced to dodge Saul's attempts to murder him. And what does that mean for us? Well, it means, dear friends, that we have to recognize how much jealousy can harm us today. Jealousy can harm a marriage. It can harm a family. It can harm a work relationship. Only the devil benefits from jealousy. The second lesson. Jealousy can easily lead to other feelings and emotions. You see, in the case of Saul, it didn't stop with just being jealous, just having those feelings. It began to progress to a point where that jealousy would have led Saul to murder David. The third lesson. When we give in to jealousy, we are controlled by it. It becomes the force of our life, making us do things, and the outcome can never be good. A fourth lesson. It might help us as we think about this situation, as we try to learn how terrible jealousy or envy can be, by remembering that it was a major reason the Jews killed Jesus. You know, sometimes in the Bible, the words jealousy and envy are used very close together. Sometimes one word is translated one way and the other word is translated a different way. But we know that in the case of the Jews, they became envious of Jesus because the multitudes were coming to him, and they saw that they were losing their hold on the people. And that jealousy drove them to do whatever they had to do to stop Jesus, even if that meant killing an innocent person. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves some questions. Am I truly able to rejoice in the good fortune of others? Or do I think, why should he get that credit and I not get it? Does it bother me when someone else is praised for their work and I am not praised for my work? Does that bother me? Am I jealous? I thought about this particular verse from the Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 6. The latter part of the verse says, "Jealousy as cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement fire." Is jealousy a problem for you? If it is, recognize it. Don't try to give it a different name. If you're jealous, recognize it. But secondly, you need to repent of that jealousy because you know it's only going to cause harm. And then you need, thirdly, to resolve that you're going to get out of that pattern of living. Ask God to forgive you, and He will. And then determine that you will put on those characteristics that are not like jealousy, but are like Jesus, the one who so loved us. Next week, we're going to see the sad end to Saul's life. It is truly a sad story to see a man who had so much potential give way to sin and ultimately lose his life. We want to tell you one more thing, and that is that if you are a person who needs help spiritually, if you need to talk to someone, if you need to study the Bible with someone to get you closer to God, we are available to do that. Please don't hesitate to ask if we can help you in any way. May God bless you as we try to live the kind of lives that will honor God. Thank you.